We have Ricardo. He's an economist from Harvard. So, how about that? But let me just say, as I mentioned earlier, he's definitely someone who is not afraid to enter the fray of reality in politics, besides being a standing academic. Ricardo has also been very involved in democratic politics in Venezuela, which is in itself an interesting case study of the failures of economic policy. But for that, you can ask him over lunch or dinner or over drinks. But here is Ricardo.
Thank you. Estamos empezando 10:15. All right. Well, it's really a pleasure to be back at Santa Fe. I love Santa Fe. It has influenced my thinking a lot. And I love the intellectual atmosphere and the food. And while I was having food last night, more or less my third wine glass, they told me that I had to speak not in this small group workshop, the kickoff day about what the geeks were going to do, but that I was going to speak to the board of trustees and the business network. So when I got home after my seventh glass of wine, I decided that what I had prepared was inappropriate, and that I had to prepare something else, but I could not repeat the presentation I did in November or earlier stuff that you've already heard. So this is a presentation that is new. It's done with about 2 hours sleep. So forgive me for they say that not everything, as they say, there's both stuff that is new and stuff that is good. I hope that what's new is not good, or you know how the story goes. I hope that the balance between good and new is appropriate. Where's my presentation? Desktop, sorry. No. Okay, close this. Doesn't let me close it. So desktop. Okay, I guess I click here. No. Where cancel? Okay, cancel and keep on canceling. There I am. Okay, good, excellent. So, this is going to be a 3-week process of opening this black box of technology and what's in it. But before we open the black box of technology, it would be useful to know what we want that explanation to be able to do, and what the box looks from the outside. So I'm going to go very quickly through some of the stuff that Eric mentioned, but I'm going to emphasize something that is very close to my thinking, which I'm doing economic development. My question is, gee, all these geeks have invented all this stuff. Why haven't the rest of the world just imitated? And if the world has invented a way to live at $50,000 of income per capita, why do people live at 1,000 or 2,000, right? So the question is not so much, okay, what's the new innovation going to come from, but what about technological diffusion? What is a process whereby the technology diffuses, and what does it tell us about technology to explain why it diffuses the way it does, okay? So the first thing we know, as Eric said, is that growth is a very recent historical phenomenon, and incomes per capita were very, very stable for a very long time. And it's only been recently that it has skyrocketed. This is by century from Brad DeLong. And this is for the U.S. from Madison. So it's a very consistent picture. Incomes per capita in the U.S. have gone up by a factor of 25 since 1820 or so. And this is a process that happened in some countries and not in others, meaning that while differences in income per capita here were, say, 3-to-1, now you can measure differences in income per capita of over 100-to-1. So that means that these guys figure out maybe something to do, and these guys have not imitated. Okay. Now, the same thing can be said about population growth. Population growth is a recent phenomenon, and more recently only is the fact that population growth is now declining and has been declining in the advanced countries for quite some time. This is the rate of growth world population. So we had this boom in population, and now it's declining. So what is our current understanding of this big picture thing? And this has given rise to what Oded Galor at Brown calls a unified growth theory. Can we explain in a single model stagnation, accelerated growth, then population growth, and then further acceleration of growth with no population growth or with decreasing population growth? So the standard story says, all times were captured by some Malthusian equilibrium, in the sense that productivity gains would simply increase the carrying capacity of the environment, and so more people would survive, and so productivity gains would get translated into more population. And that's why we see population growth in the world with stagnant incomes in that Malthusian phase. If you get an idea of why, of this intuition, I mean, it's the same intuition as with animals. Why do you get more animals in some areas than in others? Well, the carrying capacity of the environment. If you compare Rwanda to Somalia, one is extremely fertile and the other one is extremely arid. You don't observe major differences in income per capita. You observe huge differences in population density. Okay, so that's the Malthusian equilibrium. In that equilibrium, incomes are very low. Surviving is extremely challenging, and most people live in agriculture, fairly isolated agriculture, interacting with each other in a very limited way. Then comes the Industrial Revolution, and the first thing that the Industrial Revolution does is it causes a boom in population. Suddenly, the carrying capacity of the environment goes up by a lot, and population increases by a lot. Okay, and that happened in the U.S. In all the advanced countries, there was a population boom. And then suddenly, at some point in time, which is different from what was initially thought, because Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, when he wrote his report on manufacturers, what he said was, gee, manufacturers is really, really great because it dumbs down work so much that you can even use children and women to produce, right? So that was his point, that it allows you to use dumber workers, and that was a great thing. But that was in 1790. 50, 60 years later, there was an increased demand for knowledgeable workers that could do more stuff, and that led to an increase in the demand for skilled workers, and families and polities responded to that by creating a more educated workforce. That required families to have fewer children and to spend more money and more effort educating those kids. So it was what they call this shift from quantity to quality of children. And so fertility rates started to decline, and that's why you have this decline in population growth. That families are now less interested in just having surviving offspring and more interested in having capable offspring. And with a more educated labor force, then you get this positive feedback loop, maybe more innovation, more diffusion of that innovation, and so on. So you can explain with a single model like all these three stages, depending on some parameters that are changing over time. There are a few of the stylized facts that go with this process. One is that as countries grow, the value added and employment in agriculture decline. So what you have here is, and I'm going to present a bunch of these graphs, income per capita versus the share of agriculture in GDP. This is manufacturing. It usually has this inverted U-shaped curve, and services that have this rising thing. As incomes per capita rise, the share of services goes up. Urbanization, this is, Jeff West and Luis Betancourt probably would not be surprised by this. And, there's also an increase in capital per worker, which is what Solow would expect. But without technological development, more capital per worker should lead to decreasing returns to that capital, because how many machines can a worker run? But if there's technological improvement of work, you can invest more in machines and still and not have this declining return. So workers with more machines are more productive, and that's what you see here. Also, as incomes go up, schooling goes up. So this is the years of schooling of the labor force, not of the next generation, but of the labor force. So it's like an input to production, and we see these rising things. And the same thing with university degrees. For families to be able to make these investments in human capital, obviously they have to expect their children to survive for the investment to pay off, so it's good that infant mortality goes down. Also, to have kids, what they say, after college they become interns, and as a New Yorker cartoon said, one student said, at college, telling the other, it's an intern world out there. So if you're going to support your children that long, you cannot have that many children, so fertility rates go down and population growth goes down. So all of this is very conventional, right? So I haven't said anything new. And so the modern interpretation of all of this is that the secret of growth is the accumulation of knowledge or ideas, and that's now pretty standard in the literature. There is sort of like a non-complexity version of this, which is, I would say, is the standard in the literature. The greater number of people you can share ideas with, the greater the number of ideas you can have access to. So you become wealthier by the number of ideas you have access to, and the greater the scope for specialization and division of labor, division of knowledge. And cities allow a deeper sharing of ideas and a deeper division of labor, and that's why cities have this superlinear characteristic in Jeff's and Luis's work. And we can see this a little bit if you want to get an intuition of how the division of labor helps, if you compare modern agriculture with subsistence agriculture. In subsistence agriculture, you have a farmer who knows how to make his seeds, he knows how to make his fertilizer, he knows how to make his plow, he knows how to make everything. In a modern farmer, he uses seeds that he doesn't have a clue how to make, he uses machines that he doesn't have a clue how to make, he uses chemicals that he doesn't have a clue how to make, and he gets much more output, but with which he can pay for all of those inputs, right? So that means that in essence, he's mobilizing through the inputs, he's using much more knowledge than the subsistence farmer. But in order for him to be able to do that, he has to be able to sell his output to pay for those inputs. So if, for example, there were no roads, he wouldn't be able to sell the output, he wouldn't be able to buy the input, he has to revert to a mode of production that does not sustain that division of labor. Okay? So that's, if you apply that logic to, say, to farmers, you can apply it to nations. If you trade with the rest of the world, you can buy machines, chemicals, medicines, and stuff from the rest of the world that you don't know how to make, but they know how to make, and you access that knowledge through trade. So so the movement out of agriculture and technification of agriculture, urbanization, international trade are the engines of growth. And we see this is for the world. This is GDP per capita versus openness, and the world has been becoming richer and more open as we have gone on. Okay, so that's so far this is sort of like super standard. It's a synthesis of what we think we know. Export plus, the question was, how do we measure openness? And the answer is exports plus imports over GDP. So what fraction of GDP gets traded internationally? So let me get into the new stuff. Okay, I've been presenting all these graphs. You've seen this before. I did this calculation for 1970. So 1980. So let me show you now 2010. This to me came as a surprise because this says that if you do the calculation for 2010, countries have a smaller agricultural sector now, but they are not richer for that. So they have, instead of being moving along the blue curve, they have been moving down. So countries have been moving out of agriculture, but not getting richer, to the extent that you would have expected given previous trends. Okay? countries have been urbanizing. So this is their calculation for 1970. If I do it for 2010, again, countries have been urbanizing, and they have not been getting richer. Okay? And if you see it, for example, this is one way to show it, two cross sections. This is sort of like two time series. Here is Turkey and Mexico, and this is sort of like back in 1964, and that's 2008. When Turkey and Mexico, when France was at Turkey and Mexico's rate of urbanization, France was like twice as rich. So it's not that countries are, in this process, are repeating the levels of income of before. And this is weird because when France was at those levels of urbanization, technology was lousy. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have personal computers. Why is it that today Mexico and Turkey are at levels of urbanization that France had back in 1950, and they are not able to replicate the incomes per capita of France in the 1960s? See? Why is it that urbanization has not been accompanied by an acceleration of growth, but a substitution of growth in some sense? Same thing with industry. Countries have been deindustrializing. It's not that they have been moving up the industrial, as their incomes have been going up, they have been becoming more industrialized. They have been deindustrializing. And they have becoming more service-oriented to an extent faster than what you would have expected given their rise in incomes. Okay. Now, maybe you might say that's because they did not invest more. Maybe they urbanized but did not equip their workers with machines. No, they equipped their workers with more machines. Okay? So they have been exploiting, I continue. Maybe they had too many babies. So, on the contrary, fertility rates have been declining much faster than you would have expected given that their incomes are going up. Or they did not get the sort of like the growth payoff of this reduction in fertility. And the same with infant mortality. So these things have been declining like a stone, independent of what's happening to growth. And the same with population growth. So it's, again, it's not that countries are going through the same trajectory that their predecessors went through and getting the same sort of like growth dynamics out of them. Maybe it's because they did not get educated, right? No, on the contrary. They got enormously more educated, but did not get the sort of like growth benefits out of that. Maybe it's because it was only basic education and not university education. On the contrary, they've been increasing their investments in education. So they've been, workers that are more equipped, more educated, more urbanized, less agricultural. And this is the same story as I showed you before with Turkey, Mexico, and France. Back in 1960, this is 1965. This is the level of education that the Mexicans had in 1980. France had in 1965, but France was almost twice as rich as Mexico was at those levels of education. You can see it in another dimension. This is schooling in Thailand and schooling in Ghana, and Ghana educated their workers more quickly than Thailand, and they educated those workers in English as opposed to in a weird language that is not spoken outside of the country. But if you look at income per capita, these two countries diverged completely. Thailand became orders of magnitude richer than Ghana, even though they did not educate their workers more. They educated them less. Now, I presented you this idea that the world is becoming more open and consequently richer, but you do not observe that in the cross-section. In the cross-section, you observe that the world has become more open, the world has become richer, but there's no association between openness and wealth. So again, this is an interesting. So let me rephrase the puzzle. The puzzle that I think we need to think about is, why is it that the world has become more urbanized, more educated, more open? It has undergone the productive transformation out of agriculture into services in the way the leading countries have done. But when the leading countries were as urbanized, as fertile, as open, as educated, as endowed with physical and human capital, they were much richer, even though this was many, many moons ago when the technology was not supposedly as advanced as it is today. Okay? So in some sense, okay. So that's my puzzle. Why? So, and I think that in order to answer that question, we need maybe to change our view of what the hell technology is, or it has some implication for what is it that we want to call technology or think is technology or think what is that stuff that moves. So one way to ask that question is to ask, where physically in space is technology? Can you show me where is technology? I want to sort of like get my hands on it. And I'm not talking about where is technology being created at the margin. I want to know the technology that we have created. Where is it? Now you are going to tell me that probably it's on the internet. And if it's on the internet, then I know what you do when a tooth hurts, right? And what you do when a tooth hurts is that you download an article from the internet, you have your significant other read it, and they'll fix the problem because technology is globally available on the internet, right? Well, no, right? You actually have to go to a specialist that when he sees your mouth, he sees something that I wouldn't see, right? That he knows how to move his hands in ways that I wouldn't know how to move, right? He knows how to read an X-ray in ways that I wouldn't know how to read an X-ray. So he needs a copy of that technology in his brain, right? It cannot. So technology has to exist somewhere, and so it's I think useful to understand that technology may be in three different forms. It can be embedded in materials. As I was giving the example before, the farmer doesn't know how to make GMO seeds. The farmer doesn't know how to make fertilizers. The technology of how to make it is embedded in the materials he's using, and he's mobilizing that technology through the inputs or the machines he uses. A second one is that technology can be codified. It can be blueprints and stuff that you can download from the internet. It can be recipes and stuff that can be taught. Or technology or knowledge can be tacit. And tacit knowledge is complicated because it's not something you learn by reading about it or hearing about it, right? It's like learning to speak a language, right? Or to play tennis. You don't learn how to play tennis by reading about it. You don't learn to be a dentist by reading about it only, right? So there's a part that can be codified, but there's a part that is very hard to transmit, and that takes what Malcolm Gladwell called these 10,000 hours, right? So there's this tacit knowledge has to exist in brains, and it's quite complicated to get it into brains. So part of what technology has been doing, it has been moving from tacit knowledge to more codified knowledge. What academics are supposed to do is they're supposed to create frameworks and stuff for it to be easier to teach stuff, to communicate stuff. And then you can move from codified to machines. Like, for example, you don't need a translator to translate. You use Google Translate, and that's a machine that's doing the translation, not a person. So what slows down knowledge diffusion? Well, embedded knowledge can be imported. So you say, well, if countries just adopted free trade, they would have access to all of the technologies because technology is embedded. Well, they could have access to the embedded technology. To the codified technology, well, if it's all on the internet, you download it, you read it, you have it, and so on. So that part is less of a problem. So it is tacit knowledge that is going to generate the problem of knowledge diffusion. Especially when the amount of knowledge that needs to diffuse to be useful doesn't fit in a single person's head. Now but instead requires large networks of complementary skills that need to be brought together to do something. Okay, let me give you a little example of this. Let me show you, products are going to differ in the amount of this knowledge that they require. For example, here you have this family in Ecuador. This family is a subsistence farming family. They know how to make everything. They know how to make everything here, pretty much, with minuscule. They know everything. No one would know how to make this. Boeing has 165,000 workers, and they produce less than 15% of the parts that go into the Dreamliner. Okay? So not even that huge network of people has enough knowledge to create these things. And it's not just, high-tech stuff. To make a movie, this is the list of Oscars. Okay? And this is sort of, I counted the total number of Oscars that a single film can win. So I took out, animated short films, because not all films are animated short films, but they require acting, cinematography, costume design, directing, film editing, music, etc., etc. So one product, one film, requires many, many people with many, many different skills. And if those skills are tacit, okay, moving one sound editor to Albania is not going to produce a film industry in Albania. You would need to move a large set of people with the right skills that are complementary to each other that would be able to transplant that industry over there. So one of the things that we've been doing is to measure sort of like the technology that a country has. We like to look at what it is that it actually does. So, know-how, you cannot do something that you don't know how to do. So if I want to know your know-how, I'll look at what you do, and you must know to do what it is that you do. So this is a picture of what the world knows how to do. It's a matrix of international trade. So every row is a country, every column is a product, and every pixel is a measure of intensity of how much of that product that country makes. And this sort of says, there's some countries at the top that know how to make everything, and some countries at the bottom that know how to make very few things. It also tells us something that, because it has a triangular shape, it says that the countries here at the bottom tend to make things that everybody makes. So they tend to make relatively simple things. And the countries at the top make those things too, but they make things that few other countries make. So it's sort of like a growing complexity here in the kinds of things that countries are able to do. Okay? So that the process whereby this knowledge gets accumulated is not, just send the kids to school, more kids to school, or whatever. It is this accumulation of specific tacit knowledge that has to be complementary to each other and that shows these highly nested patterns. So with this kind of information of who is able to do what, we created this index of economic complexity. And this is a measure of how much sort of like tacit knowledge, or how much productive knowledge different countries have. And we can use this index to then ask the questions, why are some countries rich and other countries poor? And here is how much knowledge countries have, how rich they are, controlling for their natural resource wealth. Okay, and it says, okay, so we're capturing now something deep about what makes countries rich and not. It's what is it that they're able to do? What is the know-how that their networks of domestic agents have? And the theory is nice, etc., but it's not perfect. You see the R square is high, but not 1. This theory actually predicts, says that the deviations from this regression line are not noise; they are informative. That if you look at a country like India, this would say, gee, India shouldn't be there; it should be on the regression line. And so that error term actually correlates with the rate of growth of India. That's the reason why India grows at above average rates. And it would say, a country like Greece doesn't belong there. It should go down to the regression line. And Greece is obliging at present, So, and actually this shows that this error term calculated for 1998 predicts future growth. It predicts growth in the subsequent decade. So let me go back to the puzzle I had before between Ghana and Thailand. So if I looked at the knowledge, the productive knowledge, not how many years of schooling and so on, but what is it that the country knows how to do, And I would, so I mean, here is the evolution of years of schooling and income per capita. You see they both evolved their years of schooling in a similar way. Their incomes per capita diverged. But if you look at them in complexity space, they make a lot of sense. Thailand knew more and learned more. And that's why it became richer. It was not expressed in years of schooling. It was not expressed in differential urbanization. It was not really expressed in differential fertility. It was not really expressed, etc. It was expressed in something else that did diffuse in Thailand and did not diffuse in Ghana at the same rate. Yes? It's the application of the Google PageRank algorithm to this matrix. It says, it's sort of like an algorithm that says, how many different products are you able to make, and how hard is it to make those products as a function of how many other countries are able to make them, and as a function of how many other products those countries are able to make, and so on. So it's an iterative. Yes. So it's a very clean. Pietronero here has also developed some measures, and in 10 days or so we're going to fight it out here, thanks to this meeting. So now you say, okay, so tell Ghana to learn like Thailand, right? Acquire that knowledge. And the problem is that acquiring knowledge faces a very important chicken and egg problem, and that is that you cannot acquire on-the-job experience in jobs that don't exist. So if you're talking about learning as an individual, well, I want to be a doctor, I'll go to the university and be trained as a doctor, or I'll go to a hospital and be trained as a doctor. Well, but if you're talking about something that is new to a country, it didn't exist before, right? You cannot go and be trained in something that doesn't exist. So that's a first obstacle. Second, an investor cannot make, say, watches if it doesn't have watchmakers to hire, right? So where are the watchmakers? And nobody wants to be a watchmaker in a country that doesn't have a watch industry, right? And even if they wanted, they wouldn't have anywhere to train, right? So the question is, how does the world deal with this problem of acquiring knowledge if you want, not at the individual level, but one level up, at the societal level? How is it that at the societal level, knowledge can expand? And the answer we have been given in a bunch of papers is that they do so by moving to products that are not too far away in some cognitive space, and but depending on where you start, there may be more or fewer products. And this is the network of products. What we believe we are measuring here is how connected is the know-how required to make one product to the know-how required to make other products. And you see some products here. This, by the way, this is machinery. These are chemicals. Those are electronics. Over there in green, those are garments and footwear. In red here, it's construction materials and stuff. And then you have a bunch of peripheral products, very poorly connected, with relatively specific tacit knowledge that doesn't prepare you necessarily for the next step. They're not stepping stones. And we have found that where a country starts playing the game has an enormous implication for their ability to find paths that are more conducive to the accumulation of productive knowledge. But we also have found, interestingly enough, that countries learn from their neighbors. That there's a very, very strong geographic decay in the transmission of knowledge. And this is expressed statically here in this network which we call the country space. Here, countries are connected to other countries in terms of the similarity of what they're good at. So we look at the pairwise similarity of what countries are good at. And so in this representation, each country is connected to its two nearest neighbors in this know-how space. Okay? And in colors, the colors are by region. So you see that this network is clustered by region naturally. So if you have here, for example, Germany is most similar, is most similar to France. France is most similar to Germany. Austria is most similar to Germany and to the Czech Republic. They used to be the same country, and so on. Lithuania is most similar to Belarus, which is most similar to Poland, which is most similar to Romania, which is most similar to Bulgaria, which is more similar to, what the hell is that? Moldova, and so on. There's this beautiful island there of Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan that they're most similar to each other and so on. So it's amazing that this technology has diffused very, very locally. So the punchline of that paper, which I did with our PhD student Dani Bahar, that's graduating this year, and Cesar Hidalgo, is that that's the static picture. If you look at the likelihood that a country will adopt a new product, or the likelihood that they'll become better at a product that they're currently making, the probability that they adopt a new product goes up by 65% if they share a border with a country that is already making that product. So this says that something about knowledge diffuses very, very, in a very difficult way with distance. And this has been found in many very relevant papers. The patent citation literature that Jaffe started in 1993 shows that patents tend to cite other patents that are geographically nearby. Patent output is affected by the distance of R&D in the area, in these papers by Brandstetter, Bottazzi, and Perry. This is a beautiful result in a recent paper by Keller and Yipo. Within a firm, so you might say, well, foreign direct investment. Within a firm, a multinational corporation, the farther the distance to the subsidiary, the worse the subsidiary does. So if you think that the global company is sharing its knowledge within the organization across space, they have more trouble sharing that knowledge with space. We have here, Frank Nefke and I are doing a paper where we ask the question, tell me, when in Germany they establish a new plant, a plant which is in an industry that is new to a region, where did the workers come from? And you say, well, even in Germany, high levels of education and so on, they bring them from outside. So you can imagine that if in Germany they have to bring it from outside that region, in the developing world, there's no nearby region to bring them from. So you can imagine that the movement of this tacit knowledge in brains is going to be significantly slowed down. So in synthesis, the answer to the puzzle is that it's knowledge, but there are elements of knowledge diffusion, acquisition, and use that are not in the current discussion of growth, and that I think need more analysis. Thank you very much. Yes. I'm going to make a small innovation. Yeah, good.
So you were talking about how the spread of technology affects growth. Mm-hmm. Okay, and an alternative explanation could be that it's the guys who get there first, as opposed to other factors. So the people who are either the originators of a technology or the early adopters get to experience, hypothesis, the majority of the value of using that technologies, and the later adopters are fighting each other and therefore get much less.
Well, here is where sort of like economists and business schools think differently. Business schools say what they call get the value, they mean the profits, right? So they mean you're the first one, so you can sell the cell phone at a high price at the beginning, and you make all this money until it gets popularized and so on. Actually, what happens is that you figure out all the quirks as to how to produce it, and then once it becomes more routinized and clear, you can move it to a cheaper location, right? And they say, well, then it becomes commoditized and you lose all the quote-unquote value. But for an economist, the fact that it has become cheaper, commoditized, and so on, means that now many, many more people have access to that technology. It's good for welfare. There's less of a monopoly power on somebody who's able to extract from the rest of society and so on. So I grant you that the mechanism, and it goes back to Raymond Vernon and stuff, that products tend to be invented in sort of higher tech areas, and they tend to then move to lower locations, lower wage locations as they evolve. But in principle, that should be great, because the guys when they establish a plant in China, their production risks and so on are much lower because the technology is better known, etc. They may be selling it cheaper, but for an economist, that means that the consumer surplus is bigger. It's better for the world. It may not be as attractive for a guy who's looking at high return investments with his money. Yes.
Ricardo, thanks so much for this. The economic complexity model is based on the country. I wonder if it would be further illuminating to base it on cities.
No. Well, cities is actually a very, very active part of our research agenda. I didn't include charts on cities, but definitely it is patently clear in cities that in the same way as Jeff and Luis document these scaling effects on a bunch of attributes, larger cities are definitely much more diverse. They support a bigger variety of more complex industries. If you look across a country, how many different industries are located in different places? It's true for the U.S., it's true for Brazil, it's true for Chile, it's true for Turkey, it's true for every single country that we have had data to look at. So definitely there is a city dynamic. What I think is in the research agenda is not in the research agenda, it should be in the research agenda, is to compare cities across countries. Because what I'm showing you here is that the developing world has figured out a way to be urban and poor. Right? So, the largest city in the world is Tokyo, probably the second largest city in the world is Mumbai. So, how come you or Mexico City? So, how is it that you can be as large as Mexico City and be so far away from Tokyo in terms of income per capita? So across countries, I think that there's a puzzle to be addressed. And actually, somebody mentioned before the issues of income inequality and the impact of technology on income inequality. Yeah, Giovanni. Well, if you think of technology as participating in a network, because essentially you own this little piece of tacit knowledge that you know how to do. It's worthless. You know sound editing. You know film editing. Right? You yourself, you cannot do much. You need to mix your little thing with other people's tacit knowledge to make something. Right? So you have to be connected to the network. So my intuition is that inequality comes from differential connectedness. Now, the simplest way to connect people is by having them move around. Urban transport. Right? You say, well, just take your car, take your bus and you go to work. Well, that's easier said than done, right? In Tokyo, it's as big as it is because, they have these bullet trains and these big guys that crush people into the train, right? And you can bring in a lot of different talents to a single point of space and time, right, for them to collaborate and work. Now, in a city like Mexico and so on, how does a worker go to work? Well, it takes him more than 4 hours of commute time a day. That means that he's working maybe 8 hours. He's spending 4 hours of commute time. That's 12 hours. The cost of getting to work is maybe 2 hours of work. So that means he's getting paid 8 minus 2 is 6. For 12 hours work, he has a 50% tax on working in the formal economy. So he might as well renounce mixing his tacit knowledge with other people's tacit knowledge and try to do something on his own at home. That's essentially the reason why that's what we call the informal sector. Self-employed, micro enterprises, and so on. They are not mixing their knowledge with anybody else's knowledge. They're choosing to locate very near home or at home, right? And consequently, their productivities are very, very small because they're working with very little knowledge. Just their own knowledge, not other people's knowledge. So in the differential connectedness within the city, I think we should find some relations of inequality that in terms of differential connectedness and inequality within the city causing informality and so on and so forth. And if when I come back here in September for this cities and big data thing, we have a strategy to look precisely into that question using cell phone data.
One more question.
Oh, sorry. Eric. Yeah, sorry.
My question is related to global value chains, and because nowadays what it's moving across countries is not exactly people but information. So we have internationalization of production chains, which is making the analysis more to a sector country level or a firm country level. So I'm wondering if your matrix or your map will change once you compute this index at this level of analysis, because I think right now you're not really taking this internationalization into account of the production steps. So one country has a final product, but all behind it, it's been produced in different countries. And value added, it's not exactly split up as other measures of this production process. So I was just wondering if you have some insight on how this index would look like.
Well, first of all, you're very right and to ask this question. It's in our active current research agenda. The first thing I would say is that that process can be gleaned from this data, because it means that if there's a globalization of the value chain, so before, in order for you to be able to export shoes, you would have needed to design the shoe, procure the material, brand the shoe, market the shoe, and make the shoe, right? But with a globalization of value chains, you may have an Italian company that sends you all the materials and the blueprint, and the only thing is you have to do is stitch it together. You don't need to have all these other capabilities. What that does is it changes the position of the footwear industry in the product space. It makes it more accessible. It means you require less tacit knowledge in place to be able to get into it. And we have the result that industries have been moving in the product space, making them more accessible to middle-income countries. And that's, in our view, one of the reasons why middle-income country growth is accelerating. So this globalization of the value chain, in essence, makes more of production accessible. And so yes. The second point is that the globalization of the value chain can be. We are Danny Bahar, with whom I did this paper on neighbors. He's using data on multinational corporations and their subsidiaries and stuff to look, if you want, at the geography of this value chain. And he still finds the results that distance is a problem. That and you find it, more trivially, you can only order garments from China if they are going to come in. If you can order them, months in advance. If you need to order them 15 days in advance, 10 days in advance, 20 days in advance, you will order them from the Dominican Republic or Honduras. If it's for the U.S., you'll order them from Albania or Romania and so on. So it's not as easy. I mean, geography, we all want to believe that the world is flat, the internet is globally accessible. We need to better understand what this dynamic opens up and what are the constraints on it.
Ricardo, could you go back to the product network map chart? If you could just flash that back up, because there was a point that you skipped over very quickly on that chart that I'd just like to come back to, because I think it's pretty fundamental to what we'll be talking about in the workshop. Yeah, that one. If you could, yeah. I think as you noted, growth comes growth comes in two ways in this space. One is through innovation. If you're adding new nodes to this chart, and Debbie in her talk is going to talk about that process of how
planting new trees.
Planting new trees in this forest. Or, as you noted, moving to adjacent opportunities, and you have this nice phrase: the monkeys don't jump too far in the trees when they're kind of exploring this space. But the structure of this space, I think, explains a lot about economic growth and patterns of growth in the world. The fact that you have these very densely connected clusters around manufacturing, chemicals, and a few other sectors. Yeah. But then that the garment sector, that green one, is this kind of isolated island. Explains a lot of why China has developed, but Bangladesh has not. Bangladesh is stuck in the adjacency opportunities in that kind of green island there, whereas China made a very deliberate policy decision to make investments in the 80s and 90s in that blue space, which then opened up a whole set of adjacency opportunities for its rapid growth takeoff. So from a policy perspective, this has profound implications, because the traditional economics would say, you should just do where your comparative advantage is. If you're good at making garments, you should just make garments, and then you'll make money, and then you can trade and buy other stuff, and you'll get richer that way, and so on. Whereas this says no, comparative advantage is actually wrong. And instead, you need to think about it in terms of this network structure and make strategic decisions on where you invest. And that strategic decision should be based on the number of options, adjacency opportunities that it creates. And so I think this has profound implications for development policy, but also in thinking of a developed country like the U.S., where are the U.S.'s adjacency opportunities, where should the U.S. be investing? Looking at it from this perspective, I think, is very important.
No, I fully agree. My only comment would be to say that, to me, comparative advantage is what is it that you're good at. And you're good at the things you know how to do. So development is about learning to do more things. And right, so evolve your comparative advantage. That's what development policy is about. It's not stagnate in your comparative advantage. Is figure out, learn to do other stuff, that become good at other things. Yeah. Yes, Giovanni.
Part of my comment have been already made by Eric. And I guess, we are certainly on the same page. So what I'm going to say are just two or three addenda. One is that precisely because of the tacitness of knowledge, I think it is a bit misleading, the word that economists use, especially when they model ideas. Ideas are, ideas, you can read them on internet. And typically when economists model economic growth, say, there is an idea, then I appropriate the idea, I don't appropriate the idea. It's not the case. Knowledge is a bundle of procedure on how to solve problems, in a way, that are irreducible to ideas. Second comment, it is not that spontaneously at a different rate the U.S. innovate and then innovation trickles down, and the issue is what is the rate of trickling down. This was also the comment before. You need policies. In order to catch up, you need policies, because you don't have an automatic trickling down. And policies in many circumstances have to go against the market, because the market signals the comparative advantage. So if you are a Stone Age country, you have got a comparative advantage in stone-intensive products. You want precisely to go against the market because you want to become electronic intensive, not stone intensive.
Jeff?
I had several questions, but let me limit it to one. That is, you showed these interesting graphs of agriculture, education, and so on, and how they and their trajectories, and the difference between countries, and that was setting up your kind of your puzzle, your paradox. Why doesn't, kind of in a biological language, some analog to why doesn't ontogeny follow phylogeny, so to speak? Why doesn't each country reproduce, what a country that was ahead of it did before? And in the same way, why don't we precisely reproduce our evolutionary history as we grow from a baby to an adult? And I think that one of the things you did not emphasize, which I thought you might, is that despite the fact that they were different, the actual dynamic of each was almost identical. They all followed similar trajectories. They're just displaced, right? And which says that, so to speak, the equations, whatever they are, that govern those individual curves are pretty much the same. So the kind of the dynamic within a country is roughly universal across countries. And the thing that is different is the initial condition. Somehow the initial conditions are different in different countries. And like any physical system, until you make some truly major revolutionary change, you are a captive of your initial conditions. That sets something that you cannot change unless you do something quite radical. And so, in a certain sense, in answering your puzzle at I hesitate to say this, at a deeper level, you have to somehow go back to what was the beginnings of each of these countries. In other words, the deep history actually is playing a role in setting the stage for what has happened into the future, because the dynamic seems to be pretty much the same.
Well, thank you for the remark on this Evo-Devo puzzle, no? But let me say that my prior would have been, in a very simple model, if you go back to sort of like thinking of the world like Robert Solow, where technology is in the air, right? It's just something out there. You might imagine that this thing grows over time. And now when I'm comparing a country that is at 50% urban with another country that was at 50% urban 50 years ago, you would say, well, this country is going to be richer because it's equally urbanized, but to the present has so much more in the air than the past, that 50% urbanization plus more stuff in the air should deliver more output. And my only point is that it may not have surprised you. It surprised me. I confess surprise.
Well, I would say in the same way that mammals and birds and so forth are all manifestations of life and have much in common with one another, that once you're a bird, so to speak, and if you look at the analog to those curves, they don't change. You see this displacement, and that displacement remains the way it is because mammals and birds are different, unless something radical happens and one changes into another, to make a kind of cartoon out of it. But let me also address that. I'd also like to bring up this whole question that you very nicely articulated just then about this idea of innovation being in the air. And it goes back a little bit to Eric's opening remarks about my impression of the way innovation is often thought about is almost like, the ether or phlogiston, which was the original, the old theory of heat that somehow it flowed mysteriously between bodies and so on, and it took quite a long while to recognize that in fact heat was no different than mechanical energy that we already understood. And I'm wondering, again, going back to both of your talks, to what extent is everything in the end is energy, whether you like it or not. And even thoughts are energy. They have to be. So in some way, the fundamental question is, what is the currency of innovation, and how do you relate that back ultimately to joules per second or watts or whatever, BTUs? Because otherwise it all remains in this kind of somewhat hand-waving, ethereal way of thinking about it. So if it's serious that you want a theory of innovation and growth, you have to ask not only the questions that have already been asked about what are the measures of those, but how do you relate those measures in terms of units of operational definitions that can relate one to the other, so that you can understand the relationship between the thermodynamics of growth, the energy metabolism part, and the informational part, but which is also interrelated to the energy. So in other words, to get a complete theory, you've got to integrate these. Otherwise, it remains in this kind of bullshitty, kind of ethereal, solo way of thinking that you just characterized.
Well, I mean, it can get bullshitty on your end, too. In the following sense. Robert Gordon has this very nice analysis of the production of lumens per unit of energy. So in lighting technology, people wanted to have light at night because, right, human eyes are not well designed to see at night. And so they would start with animal fat, and then they moved to vegetable fat, and then they moved eventually to the filament, and so on and so forth. And he documents increases in luminosity per unit of energy consumed of orders of magnitude. So in some sense, you can think of innovation more than as energy and BTUs as information that allows for the efficiency of that energy to be deployed rather than the energy itself. But I know that information is order, and the question is, there is an informational theory, if you want, of what in innovation that would map into innovation.
Just I think we're into the plenary discussion now. Just a very brief response to Jeff, because I think you're raising a fundamental question for us to address in the workshop, which is this question of measures and metrics. And I think there is something big missing here that you're identifying, of some measure of entropy or order or information content. What's the sort of description? How would you describe that laptop in some fundamental way? That gets to a more fundamental level than the dollarized, measures that we traditionally use. And in fact, this is something for discussion later, but I think actually part of what's going on in your earlier graphs and those scale shifts is actually a problem of measurement, because you're using real dollars. And we should talk about it later, but I wonder if we redid those graphs in some fundamental physical measure like BTUs, whether you would still see the scale shift, or whether you would pick up that actually the function is constant, but what's moving around is our dollar measure. So I think I just want to note that this question of how we measure this stuff is really fundamental to this workshop.
No.
I actually also have a question that's related to the stability of these indicators, because so you showed indicators on schooling, fertility, and all those measures that are related to the unified growth theory, and showed that there was a certain kind of stability, but at the end they were not stable. And so the question, relationship between GDP and fertility was not entirely stable. And so my question is, what makes you believe that the relationship between your measure of complexity and GDP or growth is going to be stable over the next decades? Kind of a Philip curve related issue.
Yeah. No, I mean, I am not claiming any stability of any sort. I was just showing that you would have gotten the wrong intuition about the dynamics by looking at the cross-section. That the cross-sectional information suggests that the payoffs to urbanization, schooling, capital per worker, urban, movement out of agriculture and so on, that the payoffs of that, you would have significantly overestimated them from the cross-section. That in some sense, the technology has evolved so that we can have big cities with educated people and so on, and a lot of equipment that generate less output than they used to. So, and obviously there has to be something weird, and it must be, in my mind, it must be that there's that yes, you have the urban people, you have the education, the fertility, the this, that, and the other. There is something else that you don't have that is key to the ability to work productively. And that additional element that you're not tracking with any of these black box measures is something that we need a much closer description to. But I'm not claiming that it's these things need to have any long-term stability.
I'm wondering if you ever graphed political inclusion as for GDP, because my own instinct is that it's the thing that predicts more than any of these factors, GDP per capita. You can have a massively urbanized society with no political inclusion, and it will be very, very poor.
Well, the problem is measures of political. But if you take either the world's World Bank's global governance indicators, or if you take I'm going to show that I didn't show it because I thought it would be leave it for a question. Thank you, but. Here, economic freedom. So the problem with the World Bank is that they normalize the data every year, so you cannot use it for time-varying things. But this is the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom, and you observe the same story there. People have become freer; they have not become richer in the proportion you would have expected. But on the globalization indicators, on the governance indicators, let me tell you the following. The Millennium Challenge Corporation has as a condition that countries should improve their political inclusiveness and governance and so on, because that's, and they have a state policy statement that says because that is critical for growth. Okay? So it's part of the conventional wisdom. Acemoglu and Robinson have this book, Why Nations Fail, and so on. That claim has absolutely no empirical verification over the last 25 years. I have killed all these governance indicators to death, and countries that have more inclusive political system, more rule of law, more this and the other, over the past 25 years have not grown any faster. The countries that have improved their political systems have not grown any faster, at least in the ways we are measuring governance. At least in the ways we're measuring governance. So, or inclusiveness or whatever. So maybe it's a measurement problem. I declare ignorance on that. But to the extent that these measures are right, they provide no empirical support for your claim. Now, as a citizen, I would love your claim to be true, because I would love for, I'd sacrifice growth for political inclusiveness and rights and so on. But unfortunately, we don't have the evidence to support that claim.
Okay, but is it possible that the time scale is too small?
Yeah, but if the time scale of 25 years is too small, then it's too small for any electoral campaign, any political decision, anything relevant for policy. Yes.
So, I'm worried we're getting into additional data here, but another potential. At the risk of going down the data rabbit hole, another potential explanation is some countries have decided on, as a population, to take their excess prosperity and invest it in free time rather than in sort of economic output, right? So this is similar to a comment made earlier today. Do you have data on that, like sort of hours worked per day or something along these lines?
There is data on it, and see, we're talking about different orders of magnitude. So it's not the case. I mean, it is the case that richer countries take longer vacations, except for the Americans, who are outliers. But by French standards, the Americans are in a slave system. But so actually it works like the other way around, that as countries become richer, working days become shorter, working weeks become shorter, labor codes, so it moves a little bit in the opposite direction.
So it doesn't explain like
No, definitely not there. By the way, there's also an interesting thing that also governments have become bigger without countries becoming, countries now have a richer, that is, Brazil has a government that is orders of magnitude bigger than any developed country had when they had the income per capita of Brazil. So it's also, rich countries have bigger governments, more taxation and so on. Poor countries are getting bigger governments, more taxation and so on, but they're not as, the relationship has shifted. And
please raise your hands for questions. We have a queue. You're next, David. We have a queue already that we're trying to go through. So.
Yeah, so actually I wanted to follow up on this question related to governance, and then I have had a second question. It seems to me like one inspiration here is Hirschman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. I mean, in terms of the advantages that the earlier country has. I mean, it seemed to me the central puzzle you were posing is why Mexico is not France, and or even sort of we might say the United States is a distinct example. But in this country, one thing that's distinct about being in the United States is you don't have the United States to go to, whereas Mexico and Pakistan and India and so forth have places to go to. So even if Mexico and Pakistan and India haven't gotten wealthier, Mexicans, Pakistanis, and Indians have gotten wealthier through migration. So, and that has an implication for governance, because if you're not using if you're using the exit option, you're not using the voice option, and you don't change governance, and governance then reinforces the advantages of incumbents, and the incumbents run the industries that produce yesterday's products. So there's an endogeneity in the political process in terms of what products a country selects and the industrial organization of the country as related to the political structure. And it's not an obscure one. It's a completely transparent one. I mean, in Pakistan, the cement industry is a very big industry. That's because the military owns a lot of it. These are important industries endogenously, and there are tremendously wealthy, tremendously accomplished Pakistanis, and they're mostly not in Pakistan. So I actually think it's a first-order issue. This gets to the question about rents. I mean, you dismissed that sort of somewhat offhand, but I mean, we have the fact that cell phones have become commoditized is good for the 5 billion cell phone users worldwide, but the rents that have accrued to the cell phone industry are still mostly going to the places where cell phones were first developed. So I'm not so sure that in terms of like this puzzle of Mexico versus France, that the issue of rents, of endogeneity, of wealth accumulation, of the power that incumbency has in a politically stagnant system, I mean, it seems to me that these are actually first-order issues. I'll leave the second one for later, but the second one just had to do with the point, what this actually means for new growth theory if ideas that matter economically actually are non-rival and non-excludable. I mean, it seems like what you're saying here is completely disruptive to the way we're thinking about growth in a way that you're not even, sort of pushing as far as you might. But sticking with the governance to start with.
Well, let me make the point that a lot of growth theory has been based on the idea that ideas are non-rivalrous, right? And that the problem is that we need an institutional framework to protect the property rights of the innovators, otherwise there won't be an incentive for innovation and so on. I find that all that interpretation of the world has an enormous difficulty in explaining the great divergence, right? Because if ideas are easy to copy, then why haven't they been copied? And so there must be something else that is preventing copy. And I'm saying that what prevents copy is the fact that you need coherent teams of complementary skills to use technology. That it's not, the implicit assumption of part of the political economy literature is to say, look, technology is there. If it doesn't diffuse, it's a political story. And Acemoglu and Robinson and so on, it's all about, if technology doesn't diffuse, it's because the elites don't want it to diffuse, because they have an extractive political system, not an inclusive political system. And ergo, that's why it's like, we know how to make countries grow, but the elites don't want that to happen. And my point is that we better dig in a little bit into the technological objects to technological diffusion, right? Not only political. Now, I come from Venezuela. If you, I know how to mess up a country. Now, well. I wanted to say just one word. I love your migration story, though. Your migration story, the endogeneity, exit voice, and loyalty, and so on. I just want to point out that one of the papers that we're finishing now is one that shows migration and technological diffusion. So that countries become good at the countries of their immigrants and the countries of their immigrants. Migration also diffuses technology. And to some extent, from a policy perspective, the question is how can countries extract maximum value from their diaspora? So what will having so many bright Pakistanis abroad do for Pakistan?
Two quick questions, both following up on Jeff's very insightful questions. First is almost a literature survey question. There are three types of technology you were mentioning, one that's in essence instantiated, one that's in blueprints, and one that you're describing as tacit, which is in a certain sense distributed. I can imagine quantifying, formalizing the first one using actually thermodynamic definitions of entropy. It's going to very naturally be expressible, I would think, hope, remains to be seen, in terms of BTUs, joules, what have you. The second one, blueprints and so on, I could very easily think about formalizing in a different, very strongly related form of entropy, namely a Shannon information, Shannon entropy. And flows there would be in terms of things like causal information flows, mutual information, and so on and so forth. Tacit knowledge, as I was thinking all this through, I'm not quite sure how I would actually start to try to formalize that. And if one wants to actually follow up on Jeff's implicit program of coupling all this together to actually try to find some underlying physical mechanisms that are driving it, I would think that we would need to do that. And so my first question, which is sort of a throw out there, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, is has anybody come up with good formalizations of tacit knowledge at that kind of a physicist level, so to speak? My second question is has to do with, I think that maybe Jeff and you were in a certain sense talking across purposes. The curves that you put up there, my first reaction was the same as Jeff's. These look like they're following the same differential equations. The actual dynamics, some of the parameters are perhaps changed, but not all that much. The trends seem to be the same, but the offset's very different. which suggests very much its initial conditions. But then after presenting those curves, you did something that was actually quite fascinating. You launched into your description and discussion of tacit knowledge and showed there was that very compelling graph where tacit knowledge is geographically clumped and so on and so forth. So one way that these might be, so to speak, what you were presenting in the second half might answer Jeff's question, and this is what I want to know if this is true or not, is it the fact that the tacit knowledge that these countries that are still poor, third world countries for lack of a better name, that these countries, the tacit knowledge that they have started much lower, so that Mexico started with has a much lower tacit knowledge than did France at the same level of education, and moreover, that their neighbors were in the same boat. So is it in essence that the second half of your presentation answers the initial conditions question? That's what I'm asking. Does the data actually support that fully? You can take those initial you can take all that data and then feed it in as initial conditions and see if it explains everything.
First, I like your attempt at synthesis, and what I can tell you about growth is that when I take these metrics of tacit knowledge, whatever you want to call them, and the ease with which you can accumulate more, right? Because it depends on not only how much you start with, but how well positioned you are in that product space to keep on acquiring more. With that, we do a remarkably good job at explaining growth dynamics. I have not done the work to show that it explains these shifts in these cross-sectional things. Let me clarify that these are not dynamics, right? These are cross-sections, right? So this is the cross-section calculated in 1970. This is the cross-section calculated in 2010 for all the countries of the world, a constant sample, okay? So it's not that you're saying that there's something that has shifted in the world, across the world for all countries, right? So that is the shift you want to explain. It's not a shift between countries. It's a shift for all countries in the world. So that's the comparative static. But I'm happy to spend 3 weeks here, so we'll have plenty of chance to dig deeper into this.
This might almost be that transition point. So once again, I find myself as the token engineer in a room full of economists, which is a horrifying experience. I've actually tried to do this. Last 10 years of my career, I spent a lot of time working in the Middle East, and there isn't a Gulf country that doesn't want to be the next Silicon Valley. Which, by the way, financially is a totally negative thing to try and do. But who am I to stand in their way? And if they have enough money, I can build them a semiconductor fab. I can train engineers on how to do VLSI design, how to run the fab. If they've got some more money, we can actually build up and you very perceptively notice that you need this supporting ecosystem of other trades as well, and you need a financial supporting system. But I think you're actually absolutely right. And the heart of this issue is probably around the tacit knowledge. But I think it's perhaps bigger than you're thinking. And this question might also be more, even one for Debbie, who's not in the room, I think, at the moment, which is when engineers invent and create new technology, that particular invention is coming from only a tiny fraction of the tacit knowledge that they've accumulated. And I think one of the things that Debbie and Vlodek's now involved in this might try and do is to work back from patents to can you sort of map out backwards from inventions like that into what fraction of the sort of total body of knowledge that an engineer in real Silicon Valley is actually leveraging here. And the fact that you can't transfer the totality of that tacit knowledge means people in Oman, in Saudi, UAE, they're starting from a very tiny piece of knowledge, and they don't have the surrounding context to know what would you do next. And I think that, to me, is as someone who's tried to do this, has been the heart of the problem.
Very interesting comment.
Okay, so I found this talk fascinating, and I really like your idea of tacit knowledge as the ability of organizing complementary knowledge. And my comment would be that I have seen it, I worked at IBM Research for 27 years, was involved in many different projects. But for instance, on the micro level, I have seen the same phenomena, on the firm level, when Google was growing or trying to grow rapidly. They were hiring a lot of IBM executives exactly for this ability to organize complementary knowledge. And this idea of tacit knowledge as the capability of organize large productive network could also be replicated on the firm level.
Nice comment. Nice comment.
One comment and one question. And the comment is as follows, is that it turns out that in kind of applied philosophy and in computer science, tacit knowledge is in fact something that's always been discussed and at the fore, and people have tried to do various things with it. And I'm going to just report the fact that I've been on at least 4 or 5 NSF panels where people have proposed to work on tacit knowledge. Okay, proposed to formalize it, as David said, to kind of measure it, something, right? And it turns out that the way, I'm just going to report kind of in summary terms, the way these panel discussions always go, they always say, this is a great idea, we don't know enough about tacit knowledge, we should have more work on this. And then as these panels normally proceed, there's a 10 or 15 or 20-minute discussion about, well, what is the guy going to actually do? Well, what's a PI actually going to study? He's going to study something tacit. Well, you can't write it down, right? You can't put it down in any form. Well, I'm going to do some fancy data representation using data structures, but that's just some particular formulation. That's not general tacit knowledge. So it turns out on every single one of these occasions, the proposal has been shot down after everybody agrees in the room that it's a great idea, and then it never gets funded. And so that's the comment. Mm-hmm. And then now I want to take a kind of direct aim, Ricardo, at what you said, and that it turns out that the economists have thought about this for a long time. And in fact, in 1776, one of the most famous phrases in that book, in Smith's book, is right, the division of labor is limited by what? By the extent of the market. Okay, I'm going to repeat that for those of you who are not familiar with the phrase. And he gets this from studying the pin factory, et cetera, right? The division of labor, which I would interpret in complexity terms, is how complex can the production process be. The division of labor is actually constrained by what? Actually by size. So now if you think about change, now let's do the usual delta argument. Then the change in complexity, change in knowledge, is limited by the change in size. So now this is the reverse of what you said, though, right? You said knowledge is the answer to the puzzle. Smith, I think, is saying, he's saying that, in fact, you have the causality completely reversed. Right? Because he's going to say now, knowledge, the production of that diverse knowledge is a side effect of growth. So, in fact, the knowledge doesn't cause growth. The growth generates knowledge. And in fact, I'm going to give you a very concrete example now. Okay, and this concrete example is how many of us had the experience, I think, of kind of like, maybe taking your first. Remember back to your first job. You take your first job, you go in and you learn that, my job was Exxon Production Research Company designing synthetic fuels plants, and they had a very specific way of doing that. And they had a particular set of basically semi-tacit rules for how you design a synthetic fuels plant. And I gained the knowledge. By going into that environment. There was going to be growth in synthetic fuels. I gained the knowledge of how to do that. It was not the reverse. And so I just
yeah. Well, 2 comments. Number one, on the extent of the market and the extent of the division of labor. Precisely, I think that it's this two-way causality that causes these positive feedback loops that explain the sustained growth. That If the market becomes bigger, that tolerates a bigger division of labor, and the bigger division of labor allows you to be more productive and the market to become bigger. So I don't have any trouble with two-way causality. The idea that urbanization and free trade would have impacts on growth comes from the idea precisely that you're increasing the extent of the market. You know, if you are in a city of 3 million people, there are so many heads that you can that a barber can cut. But if you're in a village, right, you have a more limited extent of the market. So that's why urbanization and integration to global trade were supposed to increase the size of the market, allow for a deeper division of labor, and have these growth effects. And in some sense, what I'm saying is that they did ma non troppo. So they didn't. So that's with respect to your first comment. The second one was on. The difficulty of studying tacit knowledge. How is it that the Higgs particle was found? Nobody saw the Higgs particle. People saw the third consequence of the Higgs particle, right? So if something requires a lot of tacit knowledge, then training should be very long. So it should be visible in transitions between jobs. It should be visible in the kind of job histories that people have in certain functions. It should be visible in efforts that people are putting into on-the-job training and on-site training and so on. It should be visible. So it has to be visible in some other things, right, that we might be able to observe. Good, thank you.